Ken, you said something fascinating to me about the pitfalls of faithful translation, that faithfulness to the original is often regarded as the highest value. However, we can miss something vital. What would we be missing?
Oh, maybe everything. When we use the word faithful, we're coming from the perspective that there is something immutable in the original that has to be somehow expressed. And once you have that notion of something being immutable, you've already got something fixed, and things just die. So rather than the idea that there's some fixed meaning that has to be rendered in the new language, you translate all of these ambiguities, the plays on words the best you can. So this gives the reader a way of waking up or being present with the text.
Willis, I've read in an interview with you, Translator's Journal 1980, that the problem with the literal translation, as you're suggesting, Ken, is that it's a fool's errand because it results in archaic lexicon. And the result there is we lose the voice, the song, and the whisper goes unheard.
Did I say that?
Yes.
I think you said it very well.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's a silly thing, literalism, assuming there is such a thing as literal translation. There have been debates on whether you should recreate the original grammar in English, and I refrain from saying the famous people who thought that it's a silly idea. The idea of a mechanical translation tends to be a literal one. And that's as close as we can get it, and they're pretty awful.
The depth psychologist James Hillman once said that literalism is the sin of the 20th century because it robs us of symbolic thought. It robs us of simile and metaphor and music. Are you looking for the spirit of the text when you are translating?
Well, very definitely. I think that's what all three of us are talking about. But I want to comment on literalism because it's a relatively recent phenomenon. And as Karen Armstrong points out in The Battle for God, the literal interpretation of the Bible particularly, but also other texts in the Abrahamic tradition, this is oversimplifying it a bit, but it began in about the 18th century. It makes it relatively recent because...
What do you have in mind?
Well, religion was taking a bit of a beating from the advent of science. And so they started to look at what does science do that we're not doing? And what science does is insists on an absolute literal reading. When you read somebody's experiment, you don't interpret it symbolically, you don't interpret it as metaphor, you interpret it absolutely literally. And Karen Armstrong argues that this is the basis for the literal interpretation of the Bible. It is the misapplication of a modern method to religious texts.
And, you know, teachers, my own teacher, Bruno Barnhart, one of the wonderful monks of New Camaldoli, says that all forms of fundamentalism today are a misplaced literalism. There's the fundamentalism of the right that says every word in the Bible is God's personally dictated message for your personal salvation to be followed to the letter. There's the literalism of the left that says, well, Jesus couldn't possibly have risen from the dead. He must have been absconded. He couldn't have been buried in a tomb. He must have been laid in a grave. There couldn't have been a virgin birth. Jonah couldn't have taken place. It's a sort of divesting and a mistaking of truth for facticity, one of the tragic mistakes of our time. And I think literalism feeds into that tragic mistake.